Hey everyone, welcome back to the Majesty of Reason. I'm Joe Schmid, and today we're going to be looking at my responses to Trent Horn's opening statement in his debate with Alex O'Connor, or Cosmic Skeptic, on Matt Fradd's YouTube channel. If you haven't watched his opening debate, that's fine, because we're basically going to be watching it together in here. I'm just going to be pausing it at various points so that I can work through my presentation and present my responses to Trent's opening statement and his arguments. So let's dig in. So before playing the first clip or clips from Trent's debate with Alex, I want to give 5 preliminaries. So first of all, I just want to say that I love Trent, and I think he's a great thinker, and I really appreciate his work and him sort of bringing the level of discourse up a notch, as it were, and really calling people to think philosophically, think about the fundamental nature of reality. I just think that's so beautiful, so valuable, and so I do want to say that I absolutely love Trent, and I definitely want to get that out of the way first. Second of all, as many of you know who have watched my previous video, Why Am I an Agnostic, I discussed in there different foundations for insight flow. That is to say, the productive and loving exchange of ideas across ideological barriers or just across people. And I came to articulate it as perichoresis, that is to say, a kind of mutual indwelling, a kind of mutual intertwinement with your interlocutor, such that you can really, truly intellectually empathize with them, really see things from their position on the epistemic landscape, and really value that mutual dialogue, that mutual interaction, mutual intertwinement, mutual indwelling. That's also going to be lurking in the background here as well. If you want more on that, you can check out my previous video. The third preliminary is just that I want to mention that Trent is approaching the debate with 9 yes or no questions. He shows that how they eventually lead to the god of classical theism. And the fourth thing that I want to mention as a preliminary is that the video clips that I will be having are going to be on 1.25 speed. Just to sort of, speed things up in a quite literal sense. And then the fifth preliminary is just that I've only watched the opening statement. I found it interesting enough that I just couldn't help myself. I couldn't help but put together a presentation in response. So maybe Alex touches on these points later on. Maybe he doesn't. I plan on watching the rest of the video tomorrow at some point. I did want to get that out of the way, that I'm just responding to his opening statement. So without further ado, let's get into the first clip.
Yes-no questions, and then show that the answers to those questions lead to a cause of the universe that has the traditional divine attributes, or what most people call God. So let's get started. Number 1, does the universe have an explanation for its existence? We know some objects in the universe are contingent, or their existence must be explained by something else. This debate exists because of computers and internet connections. Be ready to stay up. The devices you watch it on exist because of factories and power sources. All of these things are contingent, or they don't explain their own existence. Instead, they must be explained by something else. So how do we explain them? One way would be to posit an infinite chain of contingent things explaining each other, but that doesn't explain why the whole series of things exists any more than an infinitely long chain could explain how a chandelier is hanging above my head. You could also say that an object's existence doesn't need to be explained, but this violates the principle of sufficient reason, or PSR, which says things have a reason for why they exist. We should believe this principle is true because if it were false, we would expect unexplainable events like objects popping into and out of existence without a cause to happen more often, or to put it more accurately, to happen at all. Science relies on PSR being true because otherwise we could never rule out the conclusion that things we observe simply have no reason for why they exist. Finally, without PSR, we couldn't explain negative states of affairs. For example, it does not make sense to ask at this moment, why isn't Matt Fradd's hair on fire? But it would make sense to ask that question if a blowtorch were hitting his scalp and his hair remained unburned. Both cases presuppose that things which exist must have reasons for why they exist, and they don't exist for no reason at all. But the explanation for the contingent things we observe cannot be another contingent thing. So it must be something beyond the universe, or the entire collection of contingent things, that explains why everything exists. Number 2, does the universe explain its own existence?
Okay, so essentially Trent here is giving an argument from contingency. Essentially contingent things, whether individuals or pluralities, have some sort of explanation for their existence. Consider the plurality or the collection of all contingent things. By that, by the principle that all those things have explanations, it follows that there must be some sort of explanation for the plurality or collection of all contingent things, and hence there must be some necessary being, because there couldn't the explanation for why there are the contingent things that there are can't be in terms of one of those contingent things, because it's sort of presupposing the very thing that we're trying to account for. And hence we arrive at some sort of necessary being that explains why there is this plurality of all contingent things. Just two notes. I like his taste, first of all, because I use the argument from Contingency in my debate with Randall Rouser on capturing Christianity. I can link that in the description. And then the second thing that I want to note with respect to this point is just that, he defines the universe as the collection of all contingent things, which it's not intentional, but it's somewhat misleading because there can be contingent things that are outside the universe. For instance, one might think that angels are contingent things, but they aren't, within the universe as we normally use the phrase. And we also might think that there are necessary things within the universe. So someone might think that there's some sort of fundamental ground, ultimate layer of physical reality. Maybe it's a quantum field, maybe it's some sort of particles, or maybe it's mass energy that exists of metaphysical necessity. It's not the greatest definition of universe, but I'm fine if we're using it as a sort of stipulative definition. I just wanted to flag the use of universe because if we infer that the universe has an explanation solely by means of defining universe as the collection of all contingent things, we're not automatically guaranteed to get a transcendent cause that is spaceless, timeless, immaterial, non-physical, and so on. But that's a sort of minor point. Most of my substantive criticisms are going to be coming up real soon. So let's go back and watch what he has to say for his second question.
No, because that would make the universe a necessary thing, or something that has to exist by its very nature. But there are no reasons to believe the universe is necessary, and many reasons to believe it is not necessary. For example, the question, why is that triangle black, prompts an intelligible answer, whereas the question, why does that triangle have three sides, merely deserves the retort because it's a triangle. But the question, why does the universe exist, does not prompt the retort because it's a universe, since existence is not a necessary property of universes. It's more like the question, why is that triangle black, which warrants an explanation beyond the thing that needs to be explained. There are two other factors about our universe that count against it having necessary existence: its property of change and its finite past.
So one thing that I just want to caution against is that he says that there are no reasons to believe the universe is necessary. He's not saying that there are no reasons to my mind, or, it seems to me that there aren't any good reasons, or, things like that. Or from what I've investigated, I don't see personally any good reasons to believe that the universe is necessary. No, he's sort of objectifying his sight. He's saying, no, there are no reasons for believing that the universe is necessary. And I do just want to caution against the sort of objectification of sight. If you're curious to know what I'm talking about with objectification of sight, definitely check out my video with Dr. Josh Rasmussen. We talked about how sight is by its very nature individual-based and person-based, and it's based on your position on the epistemological landscape. Also, definitely check out my my previous video, Why Am I an Agnostic, with regard to the person-based nature of justification and how our sight is not and arguably should not be objectified, or so it seems to me. Wink, wink. But apart from that, he says that there are many reasons to think it's not necessary. He's going to give three. I'm just going to focus on the first one. The question, why does the universe exist? It just seems intuitively to be more like the question, why is a triangle black, than the question, why does a triangle have three sides? A triangle's having three sides. That's almost like contained in the very definition of a triangle, right? That's sort of like an analytic truth. It's not only necessary, but it's sort of part of what we mean by triangle. It's part of the essence of triangularity, as it were. And, I do kind of agree with him there. Like, intuitively, it does seem to be the case that, asking why a triangle has three sides is a sort of categorically different question than asking why a triangle is black, and likewise why the universe exists. The defender of the universe's necessary existence is probably, and I think rightly, not going to be convinced by that. And the reason is because we have a reasonably representative grasp of the nature or essence or concept of triangularity as such. And so we know a whole host of its essential properties, its definition, and so on. And so of course it's going to be sort of self-evident. It's just going to fall out of the very concept or the very nature of the very essence of triangularity that it has three sides. But I do think the defender of the necessary existence of the universe is likely well within his or her epistemic rights of rejecting this kind of open question argument, right? Because in the case of the triangles, we have a sort of representative grasp of their nature or essence, and we can just see having three sides follows from it in a way that blackness does not. But by contrast, the defender of the necessary existence of the universe could just say, listen, we have no reason to think that we have a fully representative grasp of the entire nature or essence or character of the universe, so as to be able to mount this kind of open question argument, right? It is only if we had such a representative grasp of its nature or essence that we could reliably and reasonably infer that the question is more like the question, is a triangle black, as opposed to the question, is a triangle three-sided? So I do think there's a sort of undercutting defeater there. Like he would have to show, that is to say, Trent would have to show that we have a sufficiently representative or a sufficiently in-depth grasp of the nature or essence of the universe, so as to be able to mount this open question argument. So that's the first criticism on behalf of the defender of the necessary universe hypothesis. A second criticism is just that the exact same reasoning is going to apply to God's existence, right? So God, like, why does God exist? That seems to also intuitively be the same sort of question as why are triangles black, rather than why are triangles three-sided. We can just immediately and obviously and self-evidently see that triangles are three-sided, but it's by no means self-evident, or by no means can we immediately and directly see that God exists merely from grasping God's essence. So I think this would do more harm than good, because, the question, ultimately, the exact same kind of open question argument applies to God's existence, right? Like, what would explain God's existence? Plausibly, he's just going to have to appeal to something like, oh, well, metaphysical necessity, or pure actuality, or what have you. But again, these aren't sort of self-evident in the manner that, a triangle's having three sides is. It seems to be much more like the triangles being black, right? This is something that we come to discover upon reflection, either philosophical reflection or metaphysical reflection or what have you. It's something that we sort of come upon. We don't sort of immediately perceive it as sort of flowing from the very essence or nature of the thing in question. So I do think this first kind of reason would do much more harm than good to his case. Let's get into the second reason that he gives.
There are two other factors about our universe that count against it having necessary existence: its property of change and its finite past. So let's start with change. Change occurs when a potential x becomes an actual y. This can involve intrinsic change like growth, or extrinsic change like motion. But no potential x can become an actual y on its own any more than water can freeze itself, or a train car can propel itself. Instead, something like a freezer or a locomotive must actualize the potential for change in these objects. But of course, those actualizers only change because something else actualized their potential for change. Could an infinite series explain this kind of change? No. Just as an infinitely long train of boxcars would sit motionless without a locomotive, an infinite number of things that must be actualized by something else would be changeless unless there was a cause of the series that is just pure actuality and had no potential. Just as a locomotive pulls without being pulled, this instance of pure actuality would actualize without being actualized by anything else. And since the universe contains a mixture of potential and actual, it is not the purely actual cause we're looking for. What about the universe's finite past?
Okay, so there are many problems with this argument from change. I'll just basically outline four main problems for our purposes, and two of them I actually won't really outline. Well, maybe even three of them. This first one I really want to focus on is just that the inference to the pure actuality of the being in question is just a non sequitur on many fronts. Right, so just to restate his argument, it's just that things are changing, right? But something cannot change unless it is caused to change, right? That is to say, something cannot reduce from potency to act unless it is actualized by something already actual. And these chains of changes cannot be infinitely long, and hence there exists a purely actual being that causes, or that stands as the terminus of such hierarchically ordered or per se chains of causation, or causation of change, that is. Now, like I said, there are lots of problems, but the main one that I want to focus on is just that the inference to pure actuality is a non sequitur. Right? Recall how we characterize this. One thing is changed, and in so doing, it is being changed by another. Okay, now focus on that other. Now, it's either undergoing change right now, or it's not undergoing change right now. Right? Suppose it's undergoing change right now, in so changing the other thing, well then it's going to have a further cause for its changing, right? And so now we have a sort of a regress. And in order to stop this regress, we need something that is an unchanged changer, right? It is changing the members in this particular series without itself changing in that respect. But the mere fact that it is not itself changing in this given respect does not entail in the slightest that it has no potentials for any change whatsoever. All it entails, right? All it entails is that it is not currently changing in this present respect in order to cause the relevant changes in this hierarchical or per se ordered series of changes, at this particular moment. Really, I do think that the problem really lies fundamentally in the distinction between something's being unchanged in the relevant respect and something's being unchangeable in the relevant respect. Let me unpack this through an example. So consider one series or chain of changes, right? The noodles are heated by the water, which are in turn heated by the pot, which is in turn heated by the stove, which is in turn heated by the fire, and so on, right? Suppose further that this is a per se chain of changes, or a hierarchical series of changes, and that such changes must terminate in an unchanged changer. Now, because per se chains of changes, right, are concurrent causal chains of hierarchical dependence at any given moment, all we could conclude here is that there's something with the power to make something else hot at time t, right, without actually deriving that power to make other things hot at t. That says nothing about other causal powers such an entity may have, right? It says nothing about whether it can, in some possible world, derive the causal power in question, but simply does not in fact, that is to say, in actuality, derive it. It says nothing about whether the entity has the causal power non-derivatively at t, but fails to have it non-derivatively at some t prime distinct from t, when it is not so acting as the first cause in this particular series of heating. It also says nothing about this entity's being fully and purely and utterly and wholly actual, right? The entity could simply have potencies that simply have nothing to do with the relevant causal chain of changes in question, or, potentials that are simply not right now reducing from potency to act, or what have you. And so, just more generally then, this argument from change that he's giving just fails to deliver that the being is unchangeable or unmovable, even in respect of the causal power of the chain for which it serves as primary member, right? Again, in each of these changes, we're looking at a particular chain of changes in a given respect, right? Like heat, for instance. The noodles are heated by something which is in turn, in so doing, it has its causal power in a derivative manner, its causal power to heat. And so ultimately we have to get to something that has the causal power to bestow to other things to heat them, right? Without itself having to have that causal power bestowed to it. So in each of these chains, we're looking at a relevant kind of causal power of the chain. And so this argument fails to deliver that the being, that the first cause in this chain is unchangeable or unmovable even in the respect of the causal power of this chain for which it serves as the primary member, right? Like, although the fire may have the ability at t to impart heat to the series without actually having heat imparted to itself, right, and thereby move others to be heated without itself being moved in such a respect, it would not follow that it is metaphysically impossible for heat to be imparted to the fire at t. And even if it did follow, right, I mean, it also wouldn't follow that the same is true for times distinct from t. And again, we're focusing on a particular time because that's precisely what a per se or hierarchically ordered chain does, right? It zooms in on a concurrent chain of hierarchical dependence at any particular moment in time, and hence we're just inferring about the first member. It's causing the series at a particular time t, right? And so although the fire is unmoved at t in respect to the causal power of the series, namely heat, right, it is not thereby unmovable at t in that respect. This argument from change that he's leveling is trying to infer something that is unchangeable or unmovable in the relevant respect, not merely in fact unchanged or in fact unmoved in the relevant respect. But let's just suppose, right, contrary to what I've just been arguing, that he could establish that the first member of a given per se chain of changes has the relevant causal power in an unchangeable or unmovable manner. And not only at t, at time t, i.e. not only when the member is causing the series in question, right, but also at every other time at which the first member exists, okay? Let's just grant that. Even then, this still wouldn't get to a purely actual being, i.e. one that's unchangeable in all respects whatsoever, since it would only entail that the terminus of the given per se chain of changes is unchangeable in respect of the causal power of that series, heat, say, or, some other causal power or feature. But this is perfectly compatible with such a being having other potentials, unrelated to the causal power of the series for which the being stands as the terminus, that are simply presently unactualized. They're not presently being actualized, or are not required to be actualized for the being to serve as the terminus of the per se chain in question, right? We might try to use agere sequitur esse. I probably pronounced that wrong, but I'll just save that if he wants to use that in response if he ends up seeing this video. But I do not think that kind of attempted patch would be convincing. And right, like, even if we granted a purely actual being, right? I mean, I've just given lots of reasons to think that that's a non sequitur on many fronts, given his argument from change. But even if we granted that, we still wouldn't be able to arrive at there's this one source of all change, because all the argument shows is that each chain must be finite, such that, for each chain it must have a first member. But from that we cannot infer that there is a single first member for all such chains, right? That's just a quantifier shift fallacy. And so, one way he might try to patch this up is to say, like, oh, well, we can actually get that it's the first cause of all the chains by inferring there only could be one purely actual being. I don't personally see any problem in principle for there to be more than one purely actual being, right? I mean, like Phaser, for instance, his argument for the uniqueness of a purely actual being, he argues that for there to be two or more purely actual beings, a differentiating feature must obtain between them, but there can only be such a differentiating feature if a purely actual actualizer had some unactualized potential, which, obviously it's purely actual, so it doesn't have that. But, this is just not convincing in my estimation, right? I mean, a differentiating feature could easily be had in terms of some difference in actual features between the two things. Like an elephant and an amoeba and a planet, for instance, are distinguished by many features other than unrealized potentials. And, while having different actual features entails that one being does not have the feature that the other has, the mere absence of a feature, right, does not entail potentially having that feature. I don't have the feature being made entirely of platinum, for instance, but I'm not even potentially made entirely of platinum. Moreover, this line of argument, if successful, spells disaster, it seems to me, for Trinitarian conceptions of God, according to which there are three persons in one God. According to Phaser, in order for there to be more than one type of, or more than one thing of a given kind, right? So in order for there to be more than one divine person, say, let's just apply it to that, there would have to be some differentiating feature that one had that the others lacked. In which case, according to Phaser's own reasoning, at least one of the divine persons must have some unactualized potential. And that spells disaster on two fronts, right? I mean, obviously, since the divine persons are intrinsic to God, that would entail that God has potential intrinsic to him, which is incompatible with his being purely actual. But it would also entail that these persons are not divine after all, because God is supposed to be purely actual, but per Phaser's reasoning, right, at least one of these divine persons would have an unactualized potential in order to sort of differentiate them from one another. Now, you might just say, like, oh, well, hold on. They can be differentiated by something other than an unactualized potential. Yes, that's my point, right? That's why the original argument that Phaser offered fails, because things can be differentiated in terms of things that aren't unactualized potentials, and hence his argument for the uniqueness of the purely actual being, in my estimation, fails. And so what that tells us is that, well, obviously, this isn't representative of all arguments for the uniqueness of a purely actual being, but, one simple way that we might try to infer it seems not to work. And hence, there is this quantifier shift fallacy. I don't even have that on there, but I probably should have put that on there, right? That we can't infer that even if we get to this purely actual being, which I've argued is a non sequitur on multiple fronts, even if we could get to it, right? The mere fact that for each chain there's a first member of that chain, it simply doesn't follow that particular first member is the first member for all chains in question. So we can't infer that it's the singular source of all change. The second thing that I have on there is existential inertia. Trent actually didn't present his argument in terms of the concurrent actualization of a thing's potential for existence. He actually just restricted himself to change and sources of change, and hence, I probably could have left this out. But if he did want to extend his argument to concurrent actualizations of a thing's potential, I would definitely advise all you listeners to check out the work that I've done on existential inertia on my blog and in some of my videos. And recently, exciting news that a lot of you probably saw that on Facebook is that my paper Existential Inertia and the Aristotelian Proof has been accepted at International Journal for Philosophy of Religion. I don't know when it's going to be ready for production, but sometime within the next couple of months, hopefully. So keep your eyes peeled for that. I'll probably do a video on that on its own, but I did want to just flag this as a response to the argument from change if he's trying to derive not only a source of change, but also the source of the existence of things. That would definitely pose an undercutting and arguably rebutting defeater for his argument there. The third thing that I have there is just the gap problem, but he goes through. I don't think they succeed, which is why I still think it's a gap problem. But, to be fair to him, he goes through different divine attributes and argues. He at least gives arguments as to why the purely actual being must have the features in question. But given that they don't succeed, which I will be arguing in due time in this video, the gap problem is definitely alive and well for this argument. That is to say, inferring a religiously significant divine reality from a fact of a purely actual source of change. And then finally, Morian problems. So I explained what I mean by a Morian problem in my last video on why am I an agnostic. Essentially, it's just you adduce independent arguments that show the conclusion to be false, and hence you can just infer the disjunction and the negations of the premises. I think I've spent like 40 minutes discussing what I found personally convincing to me against this classical theistic conception of God, God as ipsum esse subsistens, and God as purely actual. I discussed my primary concerns with that in that previous video. You can look at the timestamps in the description. It was roughly 40 minutes where I was giving a sort of sustained critique of that kind of being. So definitely check that out. I won't really go into it much in here, but let's go into his argument for the finitude of the past.
What about the universe's finite past? Something is necessary only if it is impossible for it to not exist. But if the universe came into existence, then it can't be necessary. It would instead stand in need of an explanation for why it exists. One reason to believe the universe has not always existed is because the past contains causal chains that explain objects and events in the present. However, no past causal series that terminates in the present can be infinitely long because that would lead to a contradiction. Consider Robert Kuhn's paper passer thought experiment. Imagine beings called paper passers, who existed every January 1st in the past. So there's one at January 1st, 2020, one at January 1st, 2019, and so on into an infinite past. Their job is to receive a piece of paper from the passer who held it during the year before them, and to see if it's blank. If the paper is blank, then they write a unique number assigned to them on it. If the paper they receive already has a number on it, however, then they just pass the paper along to the next paper passer at the end of the year. Now here's the question. What number is written on the paper given to the paper passer at January 1st, 2020, whose year will go downhill very quickly? There has to be some number written on it, because if it were blank, then the 2020 paper passer would write his number on it. But it can't be blank, because if it were, the 2019 paper passer would have written his number on it. But the 2019 paper passer could not have written his number on it, because if the paper were blank when he got it, the 2018 paper passer would have written his number on it. If there are an infinite number of paper passers, then we have a paradox. There is a piece of paper that arrives in the present that isn't devoid of numbers, but also can't have any particular number written on it. And this isn't unique to this scenario. Other thought experiments like Thomson's lamp or the Grim Reaper paradox show that objects cannot have infinite causal histories. This means causal series must be finite in nature, and the first member of the series would have to be uncaused. And since causal chains must be finite, this means the number of events before today must be finite, and so time is finite. If the past is finite, then our universe began to exist and would require an uncaused cause for its existence. Notice that we are at an important juncture.
Well, first of all, I like his taste, because he talked about the paper passer paradox, and I used actually the exact same paradox in my debate with Randall Rouser, which is funny in a good way, right? But I did just want to flag the first thing that he said: if universe came into existence, it cannot be necessary. I mean, strictly speaking, that's not true. Something being necessary just means it cannot fail to exist. That means it cannot possibly be absent from reality. In other words, in all possible worlds, it exists. But something's coming into existence, something's beginning to exist. That's perfectly compatible with its existing in all possible worlds, right? It could just begin to exist in all possible worlds, and hence the entity in question exists in all possible worlds, and hence it is a necessary being. We cannot conflate existing in all possible worlds with existing at all times in all possible worlds. And moreover, if B theory is true, or if eternalism is true, then even if it in some sense, quote-unquote, came into existence, it would still sort of tenselessly and eternally exist in all possible worlds, assuming, of course, that it exists in every possible world, even if it has an earlier than temporal boundary. But that's getting ahead of myself, and I lean towards presentism, so that doesn't quite matter too much. But I did just want to flag this, at least just for just a general educational point for you guys, not necessarily even a debate point. We need to be very careful not to infer contingency from the fact that something came into existence. So then he tries to argue for causal finitism by means of the paper passer paradox. And roughly there are two reasons for this. So first of all, this is going to have to rely on a patchwork principle. So a patchwork principle, these things derive from David Lewis, I believe, and they're essentially both modal epistemological and modal metaphysical tools. What we do is we essentially take an isolated, closed pocket, as it were. It could be a paper passer, an individual paper passer, say, with its intrinsic causal powers. We sort of specify the intrinsic nature and character of the thing in question, and we see that it's an isolated possibility, okay? And then what we do is we take a different possible world where we have a sort of spatiotemporal framework, and this provides a sort of framework where we can sort of patch things in. We can fill in that world with isolated different patchworks. And so it's almost like you're sort of patching together a quilt, as it were. That's really, I think, where the name comes from, right? You take a sort of possible world that has a spatiotemporal framework that has enough room, as it were, to fit the possible world that you want to construct. And then you take different isolated possibilities and you sort of patch and stitch them together in this possible world, and you sort of rearrange things. And so long as, you don't violate any, so long as it's like logically possible, you don't violate any mathematical axioms, and it's like space and time permitting and like geometry permitting, what the patchwork principle says is that it would thereby be a possible world that you have just constructed. If you have enough room, if you have the spatiotemporal framework, and you're patching these isolated things together with their intrinsic causal powers, then you're thereby sort of constructing, as it were, a new possible world, and it follows that that world would be possible. And so the reason he requires this patchwork principle is actually, well, first of all, both Proust and Kuhn's explicitly say that they need the patchwork principles for the paradoxes to succeed. So that's the first thing. But I guess I should really give you the philosophical reason, not just appeal to what the arguers themselves are saying. So the reason we need it, the patchwork principle, is because Trent requires, for his argument to succeed, he needs a premise to the effect of, if infinite causal chains are possible, then it would be possible to construct such a paradoxical scenario. And since, you can't construct that paradoxical scenario, it's contradictory, right? It would follow by modus tollens that infinite causal chains are not possible. But the principal motivation for that first premise, right? If infinite causal chains are possible, then you could construct infinite causal chains in a way so as to get this paradoxical result that centrally hinges on the Patchwork principle, right? Because I mean, clearly this kind of contradictory series is not actualized in the real world, right? So we have to move to a different possible world. What we have to do is we have to rearrange things in such a way, space and time permitting, and we have to sort of insert them into these various nodes in the causal nexus, and only then can we really infer that from the fact that there is an infinite causal chain, we get that we can construct a possible world that is sort of contradictory in this manner, right? It is by means of the Patchwork principle that we take the possibility of there being an infinite causal chain, and we sort of abstract the particular nodes within that network, right? And we substitute in these paper passers, right? So we look at this infinite causal chain in one possible world. We use that as our framework world, and then we sort of take the little causal nodes that everything in that world was occupying, that infinite causal chain, and we sort of patch in an obviously possible singular paper passer, right? So we can easily patch in one of them, because clearly in our world, like 2 of these paper passers could do their job. That'd be pretty easy. And so clearly these are isolated possibilities, right? They have intrinsic causal powers of writing things on the papers and passing them and so on. And so what we can do is we can take this world, we can take this this framework, and then we can use the Patchwork principle to patch up the world so as to, put the isolated paper passers and duplicate them and situate them within each of the nodes in this infinite causal nexus, and thereby we would only then would we get this contradiction, right? So we have to use this Patchwork principle in order to infer from the possibility of an infinite causal chain to the possibility that there could be this paradoxical scenario, right? But the trouble is that Patchwork principles are extremely contestable and pose lots of problems for theism. Well, actually, there are a lot of related problems. So, first of all, think about David Lewis and think about his response to time travel paradoxes, right? So, David Lewis, I think he famously thought that, time travel is possible. Obviously there's this sort of grandfather paradox, right? Well, if time travel is possible, you could go into the past and, you obviously have the causal power to pull a trigger and get a gun and shoot your grandfather, but that's not possible, right? Because your grandfather was a sort of necessary condition for bringing you into existence, but now somehow you're going back and you're killing him, thereby removing that necessary condition so you didn't exist in order to go back and kill him, so we get this paradox. Now, what David Lewis said is that, hold on a second, yeah, we definitely have to take into account your intrinsic causal powers, but we also have to take into account consistency. We have to take into account more global facts about reality. And yeah, whenever we're doing this time travel, right, time travel is possible only insofar as the intrinsic causal powers are manifested in such a way as not to violate and not to entail contradictions with more global states of affairs in reality. And so what David Lewis said is just that no, you actually could go back in the past. It's just if you tried to kill your grandfather, right? You'd slip on a banana or something, or you wouldn't be able to exercise your powers in such a way, in such circumstances, in order to do that, precisely because it entails a contradiction that would not be consistent. And again, I'm not defending time travel. I'm just saying what David Lewis argued is that yes, you can have time travel. It's just it has to respect consistency and it has to respect broader facts of reality so as not to engender contradictions. And Patchwork principles also have to respect consistency, right? You can't patch up a world wherein this is an extrinsic feature, so it's not the greatest. But you can't take the fact that someone is the tallest person in the world, right? And in this world, and another possible world where a different person is the tallest person in that world, right? And you can't patch them together so as to have them both be in a possible world wherein they're both the tallest people in that world, right? That's just contradictory, right? But these cases are clearly individually possible, and there's clearly, a possible spatiotemporal framework that can fit them together, as it were, but yet we sort of ran into a contradiction when we did that. What we have to do is we have to respect consistency. We have to respect contradiction whenever we're doing our Patchwork principles. So, really what the proponent of infinite causal chains could do is just say, hold on a second, you're just using this Patchwork principle and you're not respecting consistency. No, that premise is false. If infinite causal chains are possible, it does not follow thereby that you could construct a scenario such that you could have these paper passers aligned in such a paradoxical way. Maybe for each number n, you could construct a possible world such that n many paper passes are in there and perform their task for each n, but it's not possible for all of them, that is to say all of the infinitely many, to do that, because that's not respecting the sort of consistency condition on Patchwork principles. And it does seem plausible, right? Patchwork principles have to respect consistency, and that's precisely what what we're not really respecting, it seems, when we're doing this sort of patching up with the infinite causal chain. And, again, Kuhns has a really rigorous formalization of it. He discusses how it relates to intrinsic causal powers, and he brings in different, weakened kind of versions of the Patchwork principle, but, we're getting that would probably plausibly get way too far ahead of ourselves for now. My point is just that it's not at all clear that we should grant that premise that if infinite causal chains are possible, then we could construct a paradoxical scenario like this. And that's just one problem for the Patchwork principle. The second problem for the Patchwork principle is just that it seems to be flatly inconsistent with theism. Why is that? Well, and not only is it inconsistent with theism, but it's inconsistent with the very argument that he's proposing here, the very PSR that he's using, right? Because if we're using a kind of unrestricted Patchwork principle that doesn't respect more global features of reality, right? Well, then we could just patch up a world. We could take a possible world with a spatiotemporal framework large enough to accommodate, a bunch of suffering people, and then we can take isolated incidents of people experiencing horrendous evils and just being like tortured, and we can sort of take those and patch them up into this spatiotemporal framework, and thereby duplicate them, and thereby create a possible world where it's pretty much nothing but intense, horrendous suffering for basically the eternity of the world. That would follow from the Patchwork principle. There would be a possible world where we could patch up things in such a manner where it's just nothing but this horrendous evil and torture and things like that just for the entire world, maybe for like a bajillion years or something, whatever, and with like a bajillion humans just being tortured like the whole time. That clearly is not compatible with God's existence, with a perfect being existing, right? I mean, just imagine if that world were actual, right? I mean, like, I think that world would be incompatible with God's existence, right? Because by our Patchwork principle, we are patching up a world wherein no goods even obtain in virtue of these things. And so it seems to me that Patchwork principles, we're going to be able to patch up a world wherein basically horrendous evils predominate, and there aren't sufficiently good reasons for allowing them to obtain. And from that, it would follow that in that possible world, God doesn't exist, because any perfect being definitely would not allow that world to obtain. And hence, we get that possibly God doesn't exist, and by the S5 axiom of modal logic, we get that God actually doesn't exist, right? Now, the response that Trent should give, and rightly, I think he's well within his epistemic rights to give, is that, well, hold on a second, right? Like, no, you can't do that patch because you have to respect like broader facts of reality, namely God's existence and God's nature and character as all loving. Like, he just wouldn't allow that, right? And so merely from the fact that you have enough room, you have like this sort of spatiotemporal framework, and merely from the fact that you have these isolated incidents with their sort of causal powers that you can patch in there and duplicate in this world, it does not follow that that would be a possible world, because it has to respect these broader, wider, wide-scale facts, namely God's existence and his character and his providential governance over creation. But now, once he uses that response, right, now the defender of infinite causal chains can use that response, right? The defender of infinite causal chains is like, whoa, hold on a second, right? Like, we have to respect broader, like global, is it more broad? It's probably more broad, who cares? We have to respect broader, more global considerations of consistency. And that's precisely what you're not doing when you're using the Patchwork principle. And again, there's definitely room for discussion and further inquiry here. But my point is just that there's no simple, easy path from the possibility of infinite causal chains using the Patchwork principle to construct this sort of paradoxical scenario that doesn't also pose problems for theism, and actually, interestingly, poses problems for a lot of things that Trent is saying in this debate, in this discussion, right? Because he's trying to use the PSR, and if we can use this Patchwork principle, well, then we can actually just patch up a world where something spontaneously pops into existence, because things do come into existence in our world, so we can just take the fact of its coming into existence, and we can take that as our sort of isolated patch. We can ignore its cause, and we can just patch that into a different world, and then that thing would thereby begin to be without any extrinsic cause causing it to begin to be, and hence we would have a violation of the PSR, which he's arguing is necessarily true, and hence these Patchwork principles are incompatible even with the very arguments that he's using for God's existence, right? We can't patch up worlds like this in such a simple manner, right? We have to respect the PSR, we have to respect more global facts about reality, we have to respect consistency. Yeah, there are just lots of big problems for Patchwork principles, yeah, just in my estimation at least. So that's definitely the major problem with his appeal here to the paper passer paradox. And actually, there is a second problem here, and it derives from the branching theory of modality. So, in short, according to a branching or Aristotelian theory of modality, possibilities are necessarily derivative from actualities. That is to say, anything is possible in virtue of either being actual in the actual world or being some potential branch that can branch off from our world by means of the causal powers of actual things, right? And so, according to this theory of modality, it's very Aristotelian. Broadly speaking, it's what Graham Oppy holds, it's what Alexander Proust holds. Rob Koons is sympathetic to a kind of branching theory of modality because it's very Aristotelian, and I think it's rather plausible. I obviously need to study modal metaphysics more in order to have a considered view, but it seems plausible. But what the branching theory of modality entails is that there is some initial world segment, whether it be finite or infinite. There's some initial world segment that all possible worlds share, and they have to share it. So there's some necessary initial segment of worlds. Why is that? Well, because as we saw, right, the branching theory of modality entails that possible worlds are only possible in virtue of being branches off from the actual world, right? It's the sort of causal powers of actual things that branch off in these different directions. And long story short, it's actually somewhat of a complicated deduction, but it's basically widely recognized that you essentially get a necessary being for free from this branching theory of modality, as long as you accept some other highly plausible principles. And so you get this sort of necessary initial segment of reality that all worlds share and they branch off of, as it were, from a sort of causal powers-based account. And it's precisely because everything is sort of rooted in the actual world, right? All possibilities are rooted in in actuality and actual causal powers, that all possible worlds sort of share this initial world segment, right? Things can only be possible in virtue of diverging from the actual world. And hence, there's this sort of initial segment that all worlds are going to be sharing. You get this sort of necessary initial segment for free under this branching theory of modality. And Oppy, I believe, both he and Koons talked about this in our discussion on my channel. I think it's called From Necessary Being to God. So definitely check that out for more details, and check out Proust's book, Actuality, Possibility, and Worlds for more details as well. But once we accept that, right? Once we accept a branching theory of modality, it just falls out of the fact of the branching theory of modality that you can't have this paper passer paradox regardless of whether there are infinite chains or not. If reality were finite in the past, well then reality is necessarily finite, right? Because all worlds share this necessary initial segment. And so clearly you couldn't have a sort of infinite causal chain as the one that he described, stretching back beginninglessly into the past. But if the world is infinitely extended back into the past, in a beginningless past, well then, because each world shares an initial segment, right, that means that all possible worlds are going to share some infinitely long initial segment, and then, they just branch off at varying times, right? If that's the case, well then, again, you can't construct this paper passer paradox, even if you have these sort of infinite causal chains, right? Because clearly you can't have them in the actual world, right? Because it's a contradiction, and you can't have contradictions in the actual world. And all possible worlds share some initial segment. According to this theory of modality, all possible worlds share some initial segment with our world, including, if the past is infinite, that would include our actual world's infinite past. And hence, it just simply falls out of that you just can't have one that has paper passers in it like that. Because in any possible world, if it's genuinely possible, it's going to have to share some history with the actual world. And if the past is infinite, then that's going to have to be an infinite causal or an infinite history. There's no way that you could have the contradictory series obtain, precisely because any world in which it obtains is a world which is such that it has an infinitely far back history that is the same as the actual world, and the actual world clearly doesn't contain the paper passer paradox, and hence any other possible world that shares that initial segment clearly cannot have that paper passer segment as its initial segment, because again, it has the actual initial segment as its initial segment. And so there's just no way that you could possibly get this paradox up and running if the branching theory of modality is true. And so once again, he's going to have to, well, not only get over all the hurdles with the Patchwork principle, but also with branching theories of modality, he's going to have to show that either they're like inconsistent with naturalism, or that they're false, which is odd because under classical theism, right, it's like in and of itself, there's this one singular initial segment. Initial just means sort of ontologically prior, if not temporally, but clearly in the case of the classical theistic God, it's just going to be ontologically prior, right? Classical theism is in some sense committed to a branching theory of modality. God is a sort of initial world segment, as it were. He's the sort of ontologically prior reality that all worlds share, and different possible worlds just obtain in virtue of the different outworkings of God's causal power, branching off from this one singular source, which is God. There's not a strict entailment there, but sits really nicely with classical theism. So it's going to be difficult for him to avoid this criticism. Now, that's not to say it's impossible. And then finally, he tried to say, like, because you can't have this infinite causal chain, right? You can't have infinitely many events before, or infinitely many events causally impinging on one another, and hence time must be finite in the past. It just doesn't follow. That's just a non sequitur, right? Even granting causal finitism, there's a clear quantifier shift fallacy here, right? Because, right, merely from the fact that for each causal chain, it has a first member, it does not follow that there is a first member for all causal chains in reality. It just doesn't follow. Like, from the fact that for all x there exists a y, it does not entail that there exists a y such that for all x the thing is true, right? So consider, for instance, for every human there exists a mother, right? So for all x such that x is a human, there exists a y such that y is a mother of that human, right? But that does not entail clearly that there is some one mother, which is the mother of, like, all humanity, right? Like, mother humanity that gave birth to all of us. Like, no, that's what the second thing in here says. There exists a y. That is to say, there exists some singular mother, which is such that it is the mother for all x, which is all humanity, right? And so it clearly doesn't follow. Likewise, it doesn't follow from the fact that each causal chain is such that it has a first member. Does not follow that there is a first member for all causal chains, or for every causal chain. And so you can't automatically infer the finitude of the past from causal finitism, because, again, you could have finite causal chains such that each of them is finite, right? But they're sort of, I guess, overlapping within the world in such a way so as to, extend infinitely far into the past. Like, suppose that each causal chain lasts for 3 seconds, and then just sort of imagine that one causal chain comes to be at the second second for each causal chain, right? So what you get is you get 3 seconds going by, so 1 second and then 2 seconds, and then the next one would start up, and so 1 second, 2 second, 3 seconds, and then that would sort of peter out, and then the other one would start up when this causal chain hit the second one, and so on, right? And so what you get is that each causal chain in this world is finite, but yet it has an infinite past. It doesn't have any infinite causal chains, right? Each causal chain is finite, but yet it still has an infinite past, and nothing that Trent says rules this out in any manner. And hence his inference to the finitude of the past does not succeed. And of course, that would rely on causal it already relied on causal finitism, and his paper passer paradox did not establish causal finitism, as we saw with the Patchwork principles and the branching theory of modality. But also, it's just the quantifier shift. So it's like 3 distinct problems in there, and there are lots of sub-problems that I was articulating. But anyway, let's get back to the video, and let's hear what he has to say by means of summary.
Notice that we are at an important juncture. We've seen the universe has an explanation for its existence, and that explanation is not the universe itself. Instead, this explanation is necessary, or it explains its own existence. It is uncaused because it is the source of all causes, and it is pure actuality because it is the source of all change and motion in the universe. What else can we know about this cause of the universe?
Now, I did just want to emphasize that him stopping at this juncture, like, he was saying that there's a purely actual source of all change. I mean, as we saw, he didn't give any reasons for thinking that there could only be one purely actual being, and hence, even though he allegedly showed that each chain is such that it has a first member, and that member is purely actual, it does not follow that there is a purely actual being, which is the source of all changes, right? That is a quantifier shift. And again, like, as I argued, he hasn't shown that it's purely actual. That was a non sequitur. Of course, we're assuming a lot of heavy Aristotelian metaphysics in the background, but ignoring that. My main point is just that, first of all, he did not establish that it's purely actual. Second of all, by no means did he establish that it's the source of all change. And maybe he got to an uncaused cause by means of causal finitism, but we saw that argument didn't succeed. And also, merely from the fact that there is an uncaused cause of a particular chain, it doesn't follow that uncaused cause is thereby the source of all causes apart from itself. Again, that's resting on a sort of quantifier shift fallacy. And so I did want to stop at that juncture and just emphasize that. So,
what else can we know about this cause of the universe? Number 3, is this cause changeable? No, for 2 reasons. First, change only happens when potential is reduced to actual, but this cause is pure actuality, so it can't change. Second, since causal chains can't be infinite, this means there can't be an infinite series of events. Since change is an event, this means the first cause cannot be subject to such an event, or it must be changeless. Question 4, is the cause temporal? No, because time is how we measure change, and because the cause of the universe is changeless, it follows that it must be timeless as well. Number 5, is this cause material? No, for 2 reasons. First, we know the cause is changeless, and matter is always changing, at least on the atomic and subatomic levels. Second, if the cause is timeless, then it must also be spaceless or immaterial, because to be in space is to be in time. Even if the cause were a simple thing with no proper parts, it would still change in relation to other things or points in space, and so it can't be confined to space just as it can't be confined to time. Number 6 is the cause.
Okay, so number 3, is it changeable? I mean, I'll agree with him, assuming that change is the actualization of potential. I mean, we can grant, it's clearly just an opening statement. I mean, he doesn't have time to, justify the entire Aristotelian metaphysical backdrop. But assuming that change is the actualization of potential, then any purely actual being would thereby be unchangeable. So I guess that's fine with me. We didn't conclude successfully to a purely actual being, but ignoring that. Is it temporal? Well, I mean, he said that time is the measure of change. First of all, this account of time is arguably false. It's not quite clear what time as the measure of change means, right? I mean, there are countless different ways to measure change, right? Many of which are entirely tangential to time. Like you can measure the quantity of changes that occur, right? Their magnitude, their quality, their probability, their spatial extent, and so on, right? These ways of measuring change seem entirely irrelevant to time. In order to avoid this predicament, right, it seems that we have to specify that time is the measure of change qua its temporal dimension, or temporal extent, or temporal succession, rather than, say, along the dimension of temperature or probability. In other words, it seems we must specify, in some form or other, right, that the measure is one of temporal duration. But now the analysis of time is just circular, right? The proposed analysis presupposes the very thing in need of explication, namely time itself. In analyzing time in terms of the measurement of change qua its temporal dimension or extent, right, we've employed the very thing requiring analysis or requiring explication. There are also lots of other interesting puzzles for this account of time. So first of all, it seems obviously possible for there to be a single instant or a single moment of time, right? After all, God could presumably just cause the first moment of time to exist, like the Big Bang, and then that's the only moment of time that he causes to exist, and then he just sort of he just removes his bestowal of being to the created order, and so the created order exists at that first moment of time, but no moments later than that. But in that case, we have time without change, right? Because change requires going from something to something, right? Change requires going from sitting down to standing, or from A to B, and that takes some amount of time. What follows from that is that there's no change in a world in which there only exists a single moment. But then time can't be the measure of change, because in such a world there's time, clearly, right? There is this singular moment, but there's no change. And hence time cannot just be the measure of change. There are lots of other problems for this account of change, different really interesting puzzles from indeterministic particle decay that are causally isolated, and other things that pose some pretty big problems or challenges for this account of time. But let's just move on to one final criticism of this step, that the being in question is timeless, and well, apart from the different Morean problems that we might level against that, the different arguments against timelessness, from changing knowledge of changing temporal actualities and so on. Again, just see my recent video, Why Am I an Agnostic, for just a very brief explication of that. You can also see my discussion with Ryan Mullins. I think it's called Classical Theism and the Problem of Extrinsic Change, I think that's what it's called, for an explication and defense of that line of reasoning. But even granting this account of time, the original argument from, the Aristotelian account of time to the timelessness of the purely actual being, that would still fail. I mean, merely from the fact that time is a measure of change, such that if there's time, then there's change, right? It doesn't follow that whatever is temporal is subject to change, right? That consequence simply does not follow from the antecedent, right? The antecedent only says that the existence of time entails that there is some change or other, right? It does not say that everything that exists in time must be such that it changes. For all the argument shows, right, temporal reality could be such that, objects O1 through ON exist in time, but one of those things is unchangeable, and yet time nevertheless exists and passes in virtue of the changes in objects other than that thing in question. That doesn't seem to be an obviously impossible scenario, but that's precisely what Trent would have to rule out in order to infer the atemporality or the timelessness of the being in question. Moving on to his fifth question, is it material? His main thing is just that, his main claim was that matter is always changing. That is kind of plausible, but it's still questionable in some regards. Like, presumably we don't have access, epistemic access, at least at present, to the sort of whatever is the fundamental layer, the fundamental ultimate layer of material physical reality, if there is one, of course. But if that's the case, that we don't really have epistemic access to it because we don't experience it, plausibly it might be beyond our current technological capacities, our scientific investigations. We can only get so low into the quantum realm, right? If that's the case, well then we might be able to sort of inductively infer that, well, if all the material things that we've encountered are changeable or changing, then whatever this fundamental thing is also changing. Like, we might be able to do that, but it doesn't seem as though we can sort of confidently say that matter as such is always changing, precisely because we don't really have epistemic access to that, or plausibly we don't have epistemic access, at least at present, to whatever that fundamental ground layer of physical reality is, that deepest, most ultimate layer, as it were. And moreover, I'd be interested in seeing why he thinks that being spatial entails being in time, right? I mean, like, there are clearly coherent examples of current physical theory where people have proposals that the physical universe is really in its most fundamental layers is ultimately timeless, and time is sort of derivative from more fundamental facts. And if that's the case, well then clearly, I mean, these things are obviously extended and spatial, but they're not temporal. They don't exist in time, but they're sort of tenseless and timeless facts that are sort of spatially extended, that are material, but that are nevertheless not in time, right? So it's not at all clear how or why he's able to justifiably infer that being spatial entails being in time. That's my main criticism of that, and then we'll get into his claim that is it limited in this next clip.
Number 6, is the cause limited? No, because that would contradict the cause being pure actuality. To impose a limit on something would be the same as saying there is a potential for that thing which the thing in question can never actualize. That means the cause's causal power could not be limited, which is another way of saying the cause is all-powerful, or there is nothing it can't do. And if the cause can bring something into existence from nothing, then there really is nothing it can't do if it can accomplish that feat. Number 7, is the cause necessary? Yes, because if it were contingent, or if it depended on something else in order to exist, then this cause would need an explanation for why it exists, and our argument would start all over again. Also, because this cause is changeless, it can't go out of existence, because going from being existent to non-existent is a temporal and mutable process, and we know the cause of the universe is timeless and changeless. Moreover, in being pure actuality, this cause would have no potential for non-existence, and so could not fail to exist. Question 8, is the cause personal? Yes, and here are 5 reasons to think so.
The argument for the unlimited nature of this being, he was arguing that it contradicts pure actuality because having some limit entails having some unrealized potentiality. It seems to me that that's just like a clear non sequitur. No, like, limits do not automatically correspond to some unrealized potentiality, right? Like, I'm limited insofar as, like, I can't run as fast as a cheetah, but I clearly don't even have the potentiality to run as fast as a cheetah. That just goes beyond my nature. Like, that's just not in the very nature or character of my muscles and my bones and so on. That's just beyond my human nature, right? And so, even though I'm limited in that regard, I don't have potentialities in that regard. It seems eminently and obviously possible for there to be necessarily had and essentially had limits on things such that they don't entail the potentiality for being different or for being otherwise. And hence, being limited is perfectly compatible with being pure actuality because its limits could simply be necessarily actual. They would have no potential to be otherwise, no potential to be different. And so this being could be limited in countless respects. It just does not follow that it contradicts pure actuality, and it seems to me just to be a straightforward non sequitur. Limitation does not by itself contradict pure actuality. In fact, something can be extremely limited and yet be, purely actual. Is it necessary? Well, I agree with his reasoning there. Yeah, I mean, if it's purely actual, then it's going to be a necessary being. So, let's dig in now to his 5 reasons for thinking that the being in question is personal.
Question 8, is the cause personal? Yes, and here are 5 reasons to think so. 1, there are only 2 kinds of entities that exist. Concrete ones, like 2 toy blocks, and abstract ones, like the number 2 or the shape of a cube. But unlike concrete objects, abstract objects like numbers and shapes have no causal power. Therefore, the cause of the universe cannot be an abstract object like a number, but must be some kind of concrete object. But we also know this cause must be an immaterial concrete object, and the only immaterial causal reality we know of is some kind of mind, which means the cause must be personal in nature. 2, there are only 2 kinds of explanations for physical phenomena, scientific ones and personal ones. Scientific explanations consist of physical laws that describe matter-energy interactions. For example, the scientific answer to the question, why is that pot boiling, is that heat is agitating the water molecules and causing evaporation. The personal explanation would involve an intention of an agent, like the pot is boiling because I wanted tea. A universe beginning from nothing can't have a scientific explanation, because a state of nothingness lacks the matter, energy, and descriptive laws that make up those explanations. Therefore, only a personal explanation of the universe remains. 3. This cause of the universe explains the existence of not just material objects, but also abstract objects like numbers, mathematical truths, and propositions. But these entities only exist in the mind, and so if these objects have necessary existence, then they must reside in a necessarily existing mind, that is explanatorily prior to them. Moreover, if this mind has no potentiality, then its knowledge of these truths could not be limited, and so it must be all-knowing. 4. Many atheists say they believe in God if they saw something like an amputated limb healed through prayer. But this means that they would pick a divine explanation for an event over simply saying the event has no cause whatsoever. But if our universe came into being just as inexplicably as a healed, amputated limb, then atheists should be consistent and conclude that the universe is a divine cause as well. 5. Our universe contains moral properties that only make sense if they have a transcendent moral source. Now, morality only applies to persons, so if the cause of the universe is the source of these moral properties, then it must be a supremely good person and not an amoral, impersonal force. Which brings us to my last question. Number 9, is the cause of the universe good?
Okay, so he gives 5 reasons. First one is basically that the only immaterial concrete objects that we know of are minds. Because it can't be like an abstract number. Abstract numbers don't cause anything. Yeah, I mean, I don't really have much to say about this point. I mean, it just doesn't strike me as very plausible. We could easily just take this as an argument for the existence of an immaterial concrete object that is non-mental, right? Like, we could actually, I mean, like, why? Like, why are these the only 2 exhaustive categories? Either it's a mind, or it's a concrete non-mental object, or it's an abstract object. Like, why are these the only 3 options? Why can't it be just an immaterial, non-mental concrete object? Like, what's incoherent about that? It's just very questionable. It doesn't entail it at all, right? Like, oh well, merely from the fact that the only immaterial concrete objects that we know of are minds. It just, that doesn't entail in any way, shape, or form that an immaterial concrete object is thereby a mind. And then secondly, his reason was there are 2 kinds of explanations: scientific explanations based in sort of physical laws and mechanisms, and personal explanations. Again, it seems to me to be very questionable. Like, why think these are exhaustive? An exhaustive characterization would be either scientific or non-scientific, or personal or non-personal, right? But why assume that the only non-personal explanations are scientific explanations in terms of physical laws and mechanisms? And why assume that the only non-scientific explanations are personal explanations? In fact, it just seems to be false, right? There are metaphysical explanations, right? If we're trying to explain the unity of parts in terms of the substantial form of a substance in question, right? That is a sort of formal causality. It has nothing to do with personal explanations, and it also has nothing to do with like a sort of mechanistic scientific physical law explanation. It's a sort of metaphysical explanation in terms of formal causality. I don't know. This seems to me to be very implausible. There seem to be other types of explanations, like metaphysical explanations. So we can really do the hardcore metaphysics in trying to derive what this explanation would be like. We can't merely infer from the fact that it's not scientific that it would thereby be personal. Like, no, this seems to be just a clear false dichotomy. The third reason was that, well, it explains the existence of abstract objects. I put that in there as like, what? It's like, where did that come from? Like, where was that argued for? Like, that was not in the opening statement. Yeah, I mean, that's the main criticism. It's just like, what? Like, where did this come from? I guess I just don't have much to say other than like that just was just not justified in the opening statement. Somehow we just got that this being is the source or like the explanation of abstract objects. Not only was it not argued for, but it does seem implausible. So if you're curious, you can check out my video, non-classical or non-traditional arguments for theism. I went through maybe like 10 different problems for a sort of theistic grounding or causation or some sort of divine activity that accounts for or explains or is the source of abstract objects. I went over different like bootstrapping problems that that's going to run into. So for instance, it seems that there would already have to be a proposition describing that, or like reporting God's existence, for instance, like God exists, or God is even capable of having thought, or God is even capable of grounding abstracta, right? It would seem as though those propositions would already have to exist, as it were, ontologically prior to God's actually doing the grounding or doing the sourcing, right? And so If that's the case, well, then there would already have to be propositions prior to God's exercising any explanatory power with respect to Abstracta, and hence they couldn't be explained or sourced or grounded in some sort of activity of God's. But anyway, that's getting a little bit too ahead of myself. Yeah, definitely check out that video for an elaboration. He also said, like, Abstracta only exist in a mind. It's just like, what? Wasn't justified. And, granted, I mean, he only has 15 minutes, and, I have this whole video to myself, but I guess I can just only say that it just was not sufficiently justified. Yeah, there was no reason given for why these things only exist in a mind. Number 4, he was talking about consistency on the part of atheists. Like, surely the beginning of the universe ex nihilo would be even more miraculous, as it were, than an amputated limb growing back as a result of prayer. And, like, yeah, maybe, but, like, I guess, like, this would only apply to some atheists who make that kind of argument, and it doesn't demonstrate that the being is personal. It certainly doesn't demonstrate that it's divine, and also, nothing in his arguments that he gave entails creation ex nihilo. He was only talking about finite causal chains, and he was also talking about chains of changes, right? None of that entailed creation ex nihilo. And indeed, there are some interesting and somewhat plausible arguments against the very possibility of creation ex nihilo. And if you're curious, definitely check out Dr. Felipe Leon's work. I had him on my channel in a video called Theism and the Argument from Material Causality, so definitely check that out. And then his fifth one was that moral properties sort of presuppose a transcendent moral source to account for or ground their existence. And because morality has to do with persons, or concerns the realm of persons, right? This being would be personal. Like, there are a number of problems with this. First of all, it just was not justified why morality necessarily presupposes, or moral truths necessarily presuppose, some sort of transcendent moral source. From what I could gather, it seemed to be just an assertion, which is fine. I mean, he only has 15 minutes, so I can't really fault him. The second thing that I want to say in response to this is that merely from the fact that the intentional objects of various moral truths concern what persons do, it doesn't follow that what grounds those moral truths, whose intentional objects are persons, it doesn't follow that whatever grounds those has to be a person. Like, that's just a non sequitur. Even if we granted that there's some sort of transcendent moral source, some grounding of morality, right, it does not follow. Right? It does not follow that it must be a person thereby, merely from the fact that the intentional objects of various moral truths have to do with persons and what they do, right? It's just a non sequitur. And then the final thing that I would probably say in response to this is just there are lots of different problems with, well, not only a bunch of these bootstrapping and Abstracta problems with saying that God somehow has an activity, or maybe you're thinking that they're grounded in his nature, or maybe are they grounded in his activity? If so, like, how is this working? Like, how is this doing the grounding? How is this actually explaining things? And you've also got, like, the Euthyphro dilemma, and then of course you got the modified Euthyphro dilemma in response to God's nature being the standard of goodness, or maybe God is identical to goodness. Definitely check out Jeremy Koons's work on this. Actually, he just recently did a podcast with on the Thoughtology podcast with Alex Malpass, so definitely check that out as well. But yeah, it does seem to be the case that there are a lot of, at least, things that need much more unpacking, much more justification and unpacking concerning how exactly this transcendent moral source is actually doing any explaining. How exactly is it grounding these moral truths? Are they grounded in its nature? Is it identical to these things? Are these moral properties identical to various causal activities of the being, or is it just its commands, or what have you? Lots of open questions and lots of predicaments that sort of hang on the horizon, as it were.
Number 9, is the cause of the universe good? By good, we mean in both the moral and non-moral sense of that word. A car has a bad timing belt, not because the belt is disobedient, but because it can't fulfill its purpose of synchronizing an engine's valves. It's bad because it lacks something it needs in order to act in accord with its nature. And this is true not just for artificial objects, but also for natural ones like trees and animals. Now, if the cause of the universe has no potential and is pure actuality, then it must be good by definition. That's because it wouldn't lack anything, and so it cannot be bad in the non-moral sense of that word. But the cause is also morally good because it is the source of objective morality, or what I call moral facts. Alex said in his debate with Frank Turek that if objective morality or moral facts existed, then this would be a compelling argument for God. So we can make an argument like this. If moral realism is true, then God exists. Moral realism is true. Therefore, God exists. Moral realism is the view that human beings discover moral truths and don't create them. Truths like rape is always wrong, or all human beings have equal worth, do not depend on human beings for their existence. Alex seems to agree with premise 1, and other famous atheists also agree. For example, J.L. Mackie said of moral facts, they are most unlikely to have arisen in the ordinary course of events without an all-powerful God to create them. But why should we believe these moral facts exist? We are confident the external world is real and that other minds exist simply because those things seem to be real. If moral truths like rape is always wrong seem just as real, then the burden of proof is on the moral skeptic to show us why we should think otherwise. Now, Alex has previously said these moral truths are the objective consequences of subjective assumptions, like the goodness of increasing well-being. But if that's true, then they aren't objective, because they depend on precarious assumptions we can and should challenge. For example, imagine we could genetically engineer human fetuses so they grow up with a desire to be slaves whose source of happiness comes from blindly obeying other people. That might cohere with the overall goal of promoting human pleasure or well-being, but many people will rightly say this is wrong because it contradicts a basic moral fact independent of that assumption, that we ought to treat human beings with dignity and respect. So if you believe in moral facts, then you should believe in all-powerful God who created them. Second, human beings are morally responsible for their actions. Alex says all physical events are determined by prior physical causes. But if that's the case and we lack free will, and arsonists and serial killers are just as determined as lightning bolts and tigers, then it would be nonsensical to blame humans for actions just as it'd be nonsensical to morally blame a hurricane. Moreover, if punishment isn't something that's deserved, but rather something the state metes out for the good of society, the state could theoretically punish innocent people, like a criminal's family members, if such an act reduced crime overall by deterring criminals who at least care for their family members. But it's objectively true human beings are capable of being blamed, and it's objectively wrong to intentionally punish innocent people. This is something that only a divine foundation of morality could make sense to hold up moral realism. So when all these arguments are seen as a whole, they form a strong case that there is a changeless, timeless, immaterial, infinite, necessarily existing, all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good cause of the universe, or what most people refer to as God.
Okay, so I'm not going to discuss much of what he says there in much detail, mainly because I'm quite tired. But like he was saying that like God creates moral facts, like he specifically used that, and it's just like that just seems so implausible. I mean, surely God is free to create things or not. God is radically free. This is a core tenet of classical theism, right? God is radically free in his creative act, such that he could have refrained from creating anything at all. And hence, it follows that anything that he creates is contingent. But truths about morality are not contingent, right? These things are necessarily true. It is necessarily true. It cannot be false. And it is necessarily a fact that torturing babies for fun is never morally permissible. That is necessarily a fact. And hence, if we take what Trent said seriously, that God creates moral facts, but yet moral facts are necessary, but yet God is free to create anything apart from himself or not, now we have a sort of inconsistent triad. Like, which is it? Is God necessarily compelled to create something? Or is it only like contingently true that it's a fact? Is it only contingently a fact that, torturing babies for fun is immoral or what have you? Or, is God not the creator of morality? Pick your poison. And moreover, I mean, if God is creating a moral fact, right, he either has some reason for creating the moral fact that, torturing babies for fun is not good, right? He either has some reason or he doesn't, right? If he doesn't have a reason, then it's just arbitrary, right? He could choose really whatever he wants, it seems. But if he does have a reason, then surely that reason is the basis for morality. It is that reason. It's part of the very intrinsic nature or character of being a baby and suffering that these things be morally wrong or what have you. God either creates these things on the basis of reasons or not. If they're not on the basis of reasons, then they seem to be completely arbitrary. And if they're on the basis of reasons, well, then surely it's those reasons that are the things that, are really doing the explanatory heavy lifting with respect to the permissibility, the impermissibility, and the various different moral properties and moral facts or what have you. But again, there are different ways that you might go about responding to that and responses to those responses and so on. The metaethics literature is very vast, but I definitely just wanted to get that out there. And then one final thing is just like, there's, yet again, it's a non sequitur that he's trying to say like, oh, well, God is wholly good. He's omnibenevolent because he's the source of goodness, right? But it just doesn't follow. It doesn't follow from the fact that X grounds or creates or is the source of or is the foundation of or explains or accounts for moral facts, that it itself exemplifies moral properties, or that it itself is good, or that it itself is all good, right? I mean, even if we granted that being the ground of morality is in some sense, a great making feature. Okay, fair enough. I mean, that seems somewhat plausible, although, that's contestable. That would need to be demonstrated. But even if we granted that, it would not follow that it's all good, that it's wholly good, that it's omnibenevolent, that it's morally perfect. That seems to be a non sequitur. I mean, again, merely from the fact that something is the source or the foundation of morality doesn't follow that it is thereby good or especially all good. That really concludes my presentation. Hopefully you enjoyed it. hopefully Trent is able to see this, but who knows? Yeah, I mean, at times, obviously, I was just like a bit scatterbrained because it's like past 12 a.m. when I'm recording this. So yeah, so thank you all for tuning in. I'm Joe Schmidt. This is The Majesty of Reason, and peace out.